Hello, today we'll be looking at the final prescribed poem for Rosemary Dobson-Canberra Morning. The poem was published in 1978 and is part of the Over the Frontier collection. And some key links to the human experience include mundanity, aging, and time. As per usual, please have a read of the poem on your own, then we'll have a look at the macro techniques together. Now, the first thing that you can make note of is the fact that the poem is an anecdotal poem. As you can see, the title of the poem is Canberra Morning, and Dobson actually moved to Canberra in 1971, so around 7 years before she had written the poem. And therefore, we know that it is a poem that is based on Dobson's reflection upon Canberra Morning. The second thing that you can make note of is the use of enjambments, and some examples are here. And essentially, through the use of enjambments, we see how Dobson is adding to the conversational tone of the poem, where it sounds as though the persona is talking to us about a morning in Canberra. You could also consider how the poem being based on morning, it links back to the idea of mundanity, where morning comes every day. So it's a poem that deals with the everyday and the details that we often miss because we take the experience for granted. You could also make note of how the poem is written in free verse and also how there are 5 lines in each of the 4 stanzas. So we have stanza 1, 2, 3, 4, and each of them have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines. And stanzas with 5 lines are also called quintains. But I think it's quite interesting for us to note how across each of these stanzas, there seems to be a different focus. So in the first stanza, we kind of see a focus on morning. And then in the second stanza, we see a focus on the school children. The third stanza, we see a focus on the driver. And then we end with a reflection. Now, let's have a go at having a closer look at the poem. Starting off with the first stanza. We start off with an example of a caesura here, after morning. And by having a caesura after the word morning, it's putting more emphasis on the word. And again, as I've mentioned before, it's emphasizing the notion that the poem will be about morning. In the next section, we move on to a simile, and what you can realize is that the simile is quite zoomorphic. And that's evident when we see how the long shadows are described as being like low-bellied cats. But I think you could also pair this with the alliterative L sound. So we have the long shadows like low-bellied, and it kind of elongates. And by elongating the sound, it's mimicking the slowness of morning. We also have the personification of the long shadows creeping on the parked cars and stealthily flattening the grass. And what that is doing is basically adding a sense of secrecy to the movements of the shadows. So the diction of creep and stealthily adding a sense of secrecy. Now, if we move on to the second stanza, the mundanity of the scene is captured once again through basically the depiction of school children at the bus stop. The school children are also described as a flock of starlings. So essentially, the flock of starlings are metaphorical of the school children. And the collective noun of flock here is adding to the loud and chaotic environment as children stand at the bus stop. I want you to make note of how this kind of atmosphere is actually a contrast to the slowness of morning that had been captured in the previous stanza. So there is a contrast in the atmosphere that is being created. Now, we also have the asyndetic structure in creating an image of these young children chattering away swinging haversacks, and pulling ribbons. And I also want you to make note of how there is the use of present tense in the ing form here, and that being coupled with the diction of swinging and pulling, that adds more action to the scene. Now, as you can see, I've written the focus of each stanza on the right-hand side. So the first stanza was on the slowness of morning. The second one, it's now focusing on the students, like the school children. And now in the third stanza, we have a focus on the driver. Now, the bus driver has a book by Sartre in his pocket. So that is an allusion to a French philosopher. So we kind of have this shift into this idea of deep rumination upon the human life and purpose. This kind of idea is extended into the symbolism of the dark glasses, where by him, so the driver wearing these dark glasses, we can't see the truth of this driver. And what's interesting to note is that he's listening to the music moodily. So make note of the diction of moodily here. But what's more interesting is the idea about the juxtaposition between the depth that is being implied in the reference to Sartre with the reference to top 40, i.e., the reference to pop music. You need to make note of that because essentially they don't really go together. But by putting these two things that don't seemingly work together, Dobson is able to shed insight into the inconsistencies that surround our world that ultimately makes the mundane full of surprises. Now, in the final stanza, we move on into a reflection now. So the persona reflects upon the fact that life gets better as I grow older. This statement is rather ironic in that it subverts our expectations of aging. Essentially, that we kind of usually attribute, or when we think about aging, we usually think about it as a negative experience because why would life get better as we grow older? But Dobson provides us with the answer that it gets better because we start to not give a damn. And the use of colloquialism here is adding to the emotiveness of the realization that Dobson wants to share to her readers. And then in the next section, we have this metaphorical expression of her looking slantwise at everyone's morning. And what that is doing is it's providing us with insight into why growing old is not all that bad. And I think what you can make note of here is that mourning here, it kind of serves as a form of synecdoche, in which it's not about only looking at everyone's mournings, but more so looking at the world slantwise, i.e. with a unique perspective. In the final line, we also have the possessive in everyone's, and that denotes how everyone has their own unique mourning. And that is essentially, again, what makes the mundane so interesting. So that is the end of Canberra Morning, and now if we move on into the paragraph task, the question for this week is what ideas on mundanity does the poem Canberra Morning explore? Now, in answering this question, what you might be able to think about is perhaps the idea about inconsistencies, and essentially, like, it's going back to the idea about the bus driver, right? So, like, how there are so many inconsistencies, or there are so many, like, surprises that we kind of overlook because we take the experience of the mundane for granted. But essentially, how if we are able to approach our daily life, or if we're able to reflect upon the mundane with greater interest, we'll be able to find out more, and we will be able to appreciate the world and the experiences of our daily life. Well, now we have reached the end of the video and also the end of the whole Dobson series. I hope the videos were helpful in helping you prepare for your assessment tasks, and best of luck for exams. Good luck.